It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of love. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. The judgment of the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit is reversed. It is so ordered. Those words from Justice Kennedy 5 years ago today, as the majority decision by the United States Supreme Court in Obergefell v. Hodges expanded marriage equality to millions of Americans. I'm Christy Powell. Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show wishing you a happy Pride and remembering at all times that trans women are women, trans men are men, Black Lives Matter, and Stonewall was a riot. Before we dive any deeper into these discussions of life and liberty and the pursuit of great ass, let me, of course, introduce our very own Bianca.
Hello, everybody.
And bringing his legal mind back again is Johnny P.
Hey, everybody. How you doing?
Hey, it's a big night. It's our last Pride episode and an important anniversary. How are y'all feeling?
I'm feeling good. You know, it's interesting. I remember exactly where I was when I heard about this Supreme Court ruling. I was actually in the Caribbean with my family, and everybody else was mourning. They were just so upset, and they were just so mad. And I locked myself in the bathroom and just like danced around and cried happy tears. I wasn't even out to myself at that point. Like, I had no idea that I was gonna be benefiting from this. It was a weird moment because to that point, I hadn't actually come out as anything. And I hadn't really had a concrete idea of what my political stance was, but I knew that made me so happy. And I was so proud and so bummed that of all days, I wasn't in the US on that day. But I'm happy to be here celebrating it with y'all.
Yeah, for sure. Johnny, thank you so much for being here and for helping us kind of understand what some of those words mean and put it all into a little bit of context now that we're 5 years out.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me again. And I'd like to share my story of where I remember being when I read the opinion. I might not have been where I remember where I was because memory is a little faulty, but I remember reading it. I think I was at work. Had nothing to do with my work, but I wanted to see what the opinion had to say. And then either that day or within a couple of days, I got a call from my good friend back home, and he asked if I would read for his wedding. Not marry him, which slightly hurt.
Sure, yeah.
Perform the ceremony, but that's fine. It's fine. But I was overwhelmingly, swelling with happiness for him and for everyone else that benefited. All of us really benefited from that, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad that we're taking a moment because I remember when this happened, that speech, that majority opinion was something that you heard at a lot of weddings, and that was sort of the centerpiece of conversation for a long time. And I feel like it's been largely forgotten. And I am excited to kind of dive in and ask the question of what did this decision get us? Where did it lead us? Has it been successful? Has it been effective for the past 5 years? And I appreciate y'all being here and helping us get that conversation rolling.
Oh, for sure. I'm excited. It's a good intro, Christy. I like it.
Well, if anybody out there has any thoughts or opinions, if you remember where you were at the time, or whatever else, we hope that you'll give us a call. We're going to jump into it.
Yes, and just a note, you can now call us through a link on your computer no matter where you are in the world. So that's exciting. Visit tiny.cc/callsex. I am soliciting you for sex calls, but I'm not being paid, so it's okay.
Yeah, that's definitely getting us demonetized.
How many cents per minute is the call?
It's free. It's free.
It's free.
Wow.
Free from anywhere in the world to call and speak with Vi. We've got operators and call screeners standing by. So to look at this, I mean, it's been 5 years, and I know that for me personally, in a lot of ways, it almost feels quaint to like look back on a time where people did have to drive to a different state in order to get married. To think about the fact that we had this weird In Defense of Marriage Act creating this bizarre patchwork of different laws in different states. And thankfully, in the lead up to this decision, there was a huge surge of support for marriage equality. At the time that this decision was made, about 60% of Americans supported marriage equality. Now we're up to about 67%. And in the years previous to this decision and in the years since, it's been more or less about a 1%, 1.5% increase each year. But it seems to have kind of stalled out. So even though approval of same-sex marriage seems to be at an all-time high, it doesn't seem to be changing. And so I'm curious, as we look at this, what did the Obergefell decision gain us? And has it had a meaningful impact on people's opinions on this culture war that we see really coming to a head this summer?
Well, Christy, you and I were talking about this before the show started. Did the decision? So the decision was clearly affected by changing attitudes about same-sex couples and their right to enjoy the freedoms that opposite-sex couples have had since the beginning of time, I guess. But did the decision itself have an effect upon society? You quote that number, 67%. That's not a significant increase considering it's been 5 years and the buildings haven't been burning, at least not because of same-sex marriage. Things aren't burning and things aren't falling apart. Dogs and cats aren't living together.
Yeah, there aren't like ranging rows of gay men going into people's houses and tearing apart traditional marriages. Like a lot of the doomsaying and the things that we were hearing don't seem to be problems.
Right. Well, there was an Onion article. I remember reading about that. Some new law proposed forcing people to gay marry. I remember reading that, and it was before Obergefell. But we were talking about the notion of Brown versus Board of Education, right? Mm-hmm. The case that integrated schools, and there was a lot of pushback about that, as you can imagine. And did that decision force America to just accept a reality? And does this decision, as Obergefell and other decisions in that line, force people to just accept, you know what, you lost this one. At least right now, you've lost this one. And you're going to have to move on and find your fights elsewhere. I think, if I'm going to be negative about it, I think the legacy of Obergefell is we see right-wing groups, anti-equal rights groups, picking on the next person down in their totem pole, right? And I think we're seeing them attack transgender, non-binary people, picking their fights there, and in some cases losing, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about later today. And hopefully this trend continues. But and I don't want to dominate this conversation, but I want to say one thing before I forget it, which is, let's not rest on our laurels and assume that because we got a few Supreme Court opinions, that means anything's in the bag. It's not over till it's over. And we've got a bunch of yahoos in government right now that are perfectly happy to pass laws and executive orders and what have you to restrict those rights. And so I think this doesn't stop until there is a Supreme Court, a constitutional amendment, and I don't know, maybe a Supreme Court amendment is where the fight ends, or at least it gets in a holding pattern. So,
No, I think that's a really good point. I think that was a thing that we ended up doing on many different fronts during the last 8 years prior to 2016, because we were like, oh, well, everything will work out. We're clearly on the right track. We can stop. We don't have to worry about anything. And I think that part of that is the reason that we're in the state we are today, because we did sit back and assume that things were just going to work out on their own, and that we didn't need to speak up. We didn't need to organize. We didn't need to keep pushing. So I totally agree with you there.
Yeah, well, I don't want to draw too straight of a line, but is there some opinion from the two of y'all then that this decision and sort of the impact of it may have kind of led us in some ways to the 2016 election, may have led us to some of the things that we're seeing in politics now by, I don't know, drumming up a lot of fear mongering on another side of the aisle? Or where do you come down on it in that sense?
I think the fear mongering would have happened one way or another. I think there were probably some people who use this as an instigation to get more active. I think that would happen with any court ruling in any area that went against their own ideology. I don't think I would go so far as to say that Obergefell did this in any way. I think that our reaction to it led us to where we are now. So the ruling itself is good, and it was a good first step, but we kind of stopped after that first step, and we should have kept going, and we didn't.
Sure. Oh, Johnny, go right ahead.
Sure. I think in the dissent, it's Robert's dissent. In there, he does talk about, and I think we talked about this on Godless Bitches once upon a yesterday, where there was a groundswell of support among the states in society that was indicating that a widespread individual, state acceptance of same-sex marriage was on the short horizon. And one of his beefs with it is that, okay, the Supreme Court comes in and smacks all that down. And it may be, and of course we have to go back and create like an alternate timeline where what happens,
Sure.
How many years? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? When Alabama decides to recognize same-sex marriage on its own? Mm-hmm. Or is it just a matter of time when we start seeing states enacting some kind of, I don't know, cross-state boycotts if you don't recognize same-sex marriages, some sort of economic pressures, and then the states fold. And then the Supreme Court weighs in and says that they can't do it because of interstate commerce issues. I don't know. But I do think that the Supreme Court weighing in on it and our reaction to that, and by our, I mean the greater our, the American society of the people who don't necessarily agree that same-sex marriage was a good idea. They were mobilized by this. And so I like the decision. I like the results of it. I don't like that they have an arrow in their quiver that they can fire about it. So,
well, I know I kind of keep circling around this same idea, but there was an article put out by Pink News that I'll link to in the comments where they pointed out that approval for gay marriage, while at this all-time high, has really stalled out, specifically since Trump, and they highlighted Mike Pence took office. And so I'm curious then if we feel like that is just sort of a blip, sort of I don't know, an aftershock of all of this, and then we'll see whether it's in another 4 years or 8 or 12 or 10 that we're going to start trending in that direction again, and gay marriage will become widely accepted, or if we're going to stall out at this sort of like 2/3 majority of approval for something that to me feels so basic and foundational to a healthy society.
What was the approval rating of the freeing of slaves? just after the Civil War. Probably was around this amount, or maybe it was even worse. And now I hope that if you were to take a poll as to whether you approve of slavery, that it would be better than 66% against slavery. I hope. I'm assuming it's in the 90s, high 90s, but
But it's 2020 in America, so who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a humanist at heart. Like, I like to believe that we are trending in the right direction, at least if you take a long enough look at it from a far enough back perspective. But this is a summer where we're being reminded that slavery didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation, that even if opinions about quote unquote slavery have changed, that we've found some rebranding and some opportunities to have a lot of those same oppressive institutions built and baked right back into our legal system.
Yeah, I think one thing that is maybe trying desperately to find a silver lining in the very dark cloud is what we're seeing right now in the current administration is that people can only make people can only resist progress by breaking the rules at this point, right? If Congress, if the speaker, if the president were abiding by the rules that we had set down and doing things in the way that they were supposed to, I think we would see that progress. And the only reason we're not seeing it is because they're changing the rules, they're breaking the rules, they're doing things that are really, really far out there in order to stall this progress. So I think that even though it's frustrating right now, it is optimistic ultimately, because it means that this is the only way they can stop things at this point is by just throwing the rule book out, which indicates that if they were to play by the rules, a lot more would be done in the name of progress a lot faster.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is that if the traditional swing of our country, where we tend to get, 8 or 12 years of one party and then 8 of another and back and forth, that if we kept on that like regular trend, that we would still be seeing that sort of steady incremental increase. But because of the, singularity that is the Trump administration, the disruptive reputation that he really campaigned on and is like throwing himself into, that is why we're seeing this sort of out of nowhere blip. But is this going to be the new normal? Is this type of like disruptive, outside of government type of philosophy going to be the way of it, not just for the next 4 years, but for American politics in general? I know it's a big question, but what's your hope? What's your faith at this stage?
Well, it's been 5 years since Obergefell versus Hodges, and we have a 7% increase in a favorability. Okay, so I'm not going to do the math because I will fail at it. But like another 5 years, then it's at what is it? Help me. 63%? 60? I don't know. Don't quote me on that. In like another 5 years, and then it just keeps on 73? Sorry. It keeps going up, and then it's only a few more decades before there's 100%. We know that things don't progress in a nice linear fashion like that. But
sure,
I think it's to be expected that there's going to be pushback, because a lot of people feel that our way of life is under attack. That's a trope.
Yeah.
But it's true. Your way of life is going the way of the dinosaur. Some parts of it, thank goodness, some parts of it are. And you might not see it today, but in the future, when you have a transgender grandkid, right? And you don't have to worry about that grandkid having to, deal with systemic oppression based upon this person's identity, you'll be happy for it. Mm-hmm. Maybe today you're not, but tomorrow you might be. But it also, this is unique in that the times that we're in, because we're getting hit by so many things all at once, right? So it's hard to get a control out of it. There's so many variables in play right now.
Sure.
In the nonprofits, we covered something where right-wing extremist groups and other kinds of extremist groups are taking this time as an opportunity to consolidate their power and to bring people in because they're in isolation. They're going stir crazy. Normal, healthy people are going stir crazy, and it's affecting them. It's making them susceptible. And people with answers and people who can create an other are able to speak with a louder voice. Even though, we can have this conversation and you can have conversations with all kinds of different people, I think there's still an effect, sort of a lockdown effect that's getting to some people. So this is not that surprising, I think. I think it'll keep trending toward inclusion, I think.
I think another thing to take a look at are the Zoomers. And taking a look at the number of people, I forget the exact percentage, but there is a substantial number of people in middle school and high school who know people who use they them pronouns, who are gay, who are transgender. So this is no longer something that is hush hush in the closet. Wait, these people exist, right? This is the internet and the way that younger millennials and Zoomers are using it is increasing visibility so much. And that by itself is normalizing a whole lot. So I don't have a lot of hope for the generations before us. I think that there are probably going to be some really valuable allies, and then there are going to be people who stand in the way of progress because it's uncomfortable. But I think that looking forward, predicting the trend of embracing that visibility and being open about who you are and the different words that we get to use now and all of this, I think ultimately it's going to get better, but it's probably going to take a couple more generations before it's a non-issue.
Yeah, well, my next question really was going to be, if we look at things like TV and movies, and I think we should probably throw in YouTube and social media, kind of the democratization of media creation and publication. If we look at all of these things, portrayals of queer, poly, and especially trans folks have gotten a lot better in the past 5 years, just since the Obergefell decision. So I've been wondering why the political divide is still so wide. And I guess what I'm hearing from you, V, is that the political divide is there because voters aren't watching YouTube. The folks who are having their opinion affected by these different shows, by these different opportunities to see how other people live, they're still kind of coming into their political voice. Does that kind of line up with your vision of the future?
Yeah, I think to an extent what you consume, the media that you watch, whether that's news or entertainment or music or what have you, is going to impact how you see other people. And what you consume is ultimately going to influence your worldview, which is why you need to be very careful about what you're reading and watching and all of that. But I think that as we become more literate in online interactions, as we start popularizing stories that fall outside the mainstream, as we start finding ways to get around things like the Nielsen rating system, right? So we don't have to worry about what one demographic is thinking in order to fund a show like Sense8, like Pose, like any of these shows that are able to be put on and distributed without worrying about what, middle-class white people who don't know a gay person to save their life think about it, right? So we're moving in that direction, and I think that the internet is the catalyst there. So again, it's a useful tool, it's powerful. We need to know that we're using it correctly, and we need to make sure that we're consuming it conscientiously.
Can I say something on that? I had something that I observed recently. I remember watching Queer Eye for the Straight Guy like umpteen years ago and thinking it was, fun. And I think it maybe did something to normalize gay folks for middle America. But I watched the first episode of the new season and I was so annoyed because it's old. It's a 90s view of, I think, how can I say this? This is my perspective on this is like being non-heterosexual doesn't mean anything. There's not a specific kind of thing that you're interested in or a particular kind of clothes you wear. You could be one of a trillion different kinds of a person. And I feel that Queer Eye hasn't kept up with that view. And of course, the showrunners of that show, I don't know who they are. I know they're trying to play to an audience, but I was like, this is like an old view of the gay world. This is a 90s view. And I mean, maybe like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy in 2020 should just be a boring group of people just working their jobs and like, oh, let me help you out with your Excel sheets. You know, like I'm all in favor of normalizing things like that. And so that was just my perspective on that. And V, you and I were having a conversation, I think it was last week, and I think that sort of ties into this topic now. Is it better? And if you think it's appropriate to bring it in now, but it's like, is it better for, let's say, Middle America? Let's say not a Middle America, because that's patronizing. Because people in Middle America have folks who are gay and bisexual and.
Hi, we're in the middle of America.
Yeah. I mean Kansas. I always mean Kansas.
I always mean Kansas.
That's
your pull quote.
Lawrence, Kansas is not backwoods. There are like interesting, intelligent, progressive, people who are doing cutting edge research into things at universities and what have you, right?
I'm sorry. The only thing that I can think of with Lawrence, Kansas is the beginning of Supernatural. Lawrence, Kansas is forever only the prologue to that show. Sorry, continue.
I missed it. Is it too late for me to go back and watch Supernatural?
Not at all. I'm restarting the entire thing in quarantine, so we're good.
You're good.
All right.
You're good.
But is it good? Is it good to have, let's say, people who haven't been exposed? Let's take the regions out of it. The people who haven't been exposed to what used to be called alternative lifestyles, right? Mm-hmm. To be exposed to those lifestyles, those people who are living in ways that they are not, with regard to certain aspects of their lives, because the other aspects are the same. They're still putting their masks on one hand at a time to go to the grocery store,
Hopefully.
or not, right? Is it better for them to get their exposure through a television show or media, so that when they encounter a family member who they didn't know was of this ilk, right? Or is it better and then they have a reaction, maybe a negative, the other kind of reaction, or is it better for people to have a personal familial interaction first? Because then, like we see so many times, I'm against gay marriage, but then my daughter came out to me as a lesbian and I support her and all of her things. And that personal connection is the thing that really turned the tide. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I have my thoughts, but I'm curious about what Christy thinks because we've discussed this briefly.
Well, I don't know if this is unfair, but I feel like the question that you're asking is Caitlyn Jenner a like force for good in trans activism? Like, is it okay to just say like any representation that is normalizing is effective, is meaningful, is helpful? And there is such a huge part of me that wants to say like, yes, let's just get as many trans folks, as many queer folks, as many poly folks like out front and center, and then let everybody sort of sort through it from there. But I have to say this summer in particular has sort of made me question those ideas, because I think about just how long it has taken to normalize Black people just existing as equal members of our society. And I think back to, not just like the over the top shows, the Amos and Andy kind of shows, but even, Green Acres and Family Times and these like different shows that are theoretically positive representations, but that are still problematic. I don't know. I don't feel comfortable as a white guy having a strong, forceful opinion about those as being difficult or setting back the agenda. But I have some serious questions and serious doubts about any messaging being effective. I do think that there's some need to to kind of hew that down a little bit.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I think that there is as long as the media that you are consuming is by the people being talked about, I think you're fine. There are going to be a range of opinions. There are going to be a range of political leanings. There are going to be a range of good and bad ideas that are contained in these various forms of media, these various channels, these various platforms. The place we get into trouble is when outside groups try and write about these people or try and report on a group that they don't understand or want to dramatize or blow out of proportion, right? So one example would be, I think that exposing people to trans YouTube and the YouTubers who are trans, Jamie Dodger, Natalie Wynn, all of these people, would be very useful. But exposing them to articles about transgender people that are written by people basically fear-mongering and using language that is inflammatory, yes, they are being exposed to the idea of being trans, but it's the lens through which they're looking that might make them freak out if they find out that their kid is trans, right? Because if all they're consuming is, oh, it's an illness and they all regret transitioning and there are the dangers of hormone therapy and all of these things that are just fear-mongering. If that's what they're consuming, yes, they're quote-unquote educating themselves about it, but they're not getting the right information or any useful information when it comes to making informed decisions for their kid. So I think, yes, media representation is good, but there are kinds that are better and there are kinds that we should be promoting. And it's the content that is created by the people themselves.
And I think that personal testimonies, rather than articles are fantastic, but I think when you read an article, you have to be a little bit open to having your mind changed, maybe a little bit more than you would than if you watched someone telling a narrative of their story, right? Because I can read an article and be like, okay, this is some agenda, but then I think my brain maybe has the ability to watch a person and tell if they're acting or if they're being sincere. I think that's a thing that humans have the ability to do. We have a bullshit detector. And I think that when maybe folks that are maybe less inclined to believe other people's experience based solely upon their written testimony, may be more likely to say, okay, there's something here. I don't understand it, but there's something definitely here. And I'm going to respect this person's position more than I did before, right? So that's maybe a halfway between reading an article about it, watching some show where it's people jumping around and being silly, and having that personal, person-to-person contact of a family member or a friend.
Well, I definitely think it's an interesting question, and I am heartened to see that there is increased representation of really almost everybody outside of that, that middle America notion that we keep kind of circling around. And I would like to think that it's a force for good. I'm definitely cautious and curious, but, I guess it'll all come out in the wash at some point. For now, though, how would y'all feel about going ahead and jumping on the phones?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Let's talk first to Scott in New York. Scott, what can we do for you tonight?
Hello. Well, first I wanted to thank you. You had actually answered a question about a poly breakup for me a while ago, back when Dedeker Winston, I think, was on with you.
Oh, yeah.
And that was helpful. But I was calling tonight because I had a question about Demi-Gender, and if you knew anything about that.
Yeah, I'm going to put that squarely on V, if I may. You seem to be the one who's all excited about all the cool words the cool kids are using.
Yeah, I've heard it used before, but I don't know if I could pull the definition off the top of my head, especially because everyone uses their terminology kind of differently. Looking here, it says, Demi-gender is a gender identity that involves feeling a partial but not a full connection to a particular gender identity or just to the concept of gender as a whole. So a good comparison here might be a demisexual and an asexual, and then an allosexual, right? So allosexuality is what most people think about when they think of sexuality. Ooh, that person's hot, I'd hit that, right? And then there's asexuality, which is some spectrum of I'm not interested to I'm repulsed by sex. And then in the middle there's this gray ace, sometimes people call it, or demisexuality, where it's I can feel sexual attraction to people and want sex sometimes, but other times I don't. And a lot of the time that has to do with personal connection and how deeply you feel towards the other person. So I would say that there's a similar comparison there with gender, right? There are people who attribute a specific gender or feel very strongly about gender as a whole. And then there are people who don't identify with gender at all. There are some people who are apathetic about it or actually dislike it. And then, yeah, there could very potentially be that middle ground of people who just are kind of meh about it. Is that kind of what you mean by demi-gender, or how have you heard it used before?
Yes, that's how I've heard it used. Yeah, basically I've lived most of my life just assuming I've been a cishet white guy, and recently, for various reasons, I've kind of questioned that, and that seems to be about the closest that I've come to what I might be, but I'm still not sure, and just looking for advice, I guess, on exploring what my gender is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
well,
awesome.
I'll tell you, one place that I always recommend to start is just How to Understand Your Gender by Meg John Barker. It's a really easy to read book that I think will give you sort of the best overview. But the reason I kicked it to V is because I tend to be a bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to a overly expansive vocabulary. And I know that that's maybe contradictory to a lot of the positions I've taken on the show, but I myself would probably fall under this demi-gender category. It would probably suit me really well. I generally describe myself as like cis-ish or sort of queer leaning, and I kind of do the like shoulder arc and like the half smile kind of thing to let people know these words are all made up and I don't really know which one to use. And so for that reason, Scott, like I definitely hear where you're coming from and I relate to it. And if this word validates that experience, then fantastic. Like I definitely want to support you in that. And we're inventing words all the time. And if this one gives you some solace, if it helps you find a community, if it helps you to understand yourself, I really never want to stand in the way of all of that. I guess my question for you and for V a little bit and for all of us is just this idea of how useful is it to continue to break these colors down into further and further and further gradients? I certainly can recognize the value in separating out indigo and blue and purple and violet and being able to have a sophisticated lexicon so we can have a complex conversation. But I guess I just don't know for myself, Scott, if I can relate something as ephemeral as gender to that level of specificity. And so I'm curious if you feel that you can, and how this word has maybe benefited you.
I don't know for me specifically because I'm still trying it on. What I can tell you is that exploring more concepts like this has helped me to understand more. Specifically, when I've explored this for a while before I even started questioning myself, but specifically learning about ace and aromantic people had opened me up to a bunch of terminology that changed how I thought about things. I was actually fairly conservative when I was young, and I used to think along entirely a binary. And then as I learned more and more over time, it started to shift to maybe it's a gradient between two ends. And now my thinking is more, as I learn more about things like bigender, agender, non-gender, neutral gender, that I shouldn't think of anything as a spectrum between two things is where I am. It's similar to how Matt Dillahunty likes to talk about when you're considering something, you only consider, when you're considering a dichotomy, I think, you only consider one prong at a time. So that perhaps the best way to look at this is not, are you somewhere on a slider between male and female, but more, what is your connection to male? If you had to move that, is it 0 to 10? And then what about female, so that you can have a connection to male and female and be bigender, or have it to have no connection to either, or have a connection to a third or a fourth or anything like that. And the language has helped me in that thinking to like expand what I think about, essentially. Sexuality, I used to roll attraction and desire all into the same idea, and learning about ace and aro people has helped me separate those as well. If any of that makes sense.
Oh, totally. That makes a lot of sense. My approach to go back to Christy and kind of play off what you're saying, Scott, is what is the spectrum in terms of personality, right? When we describe personalities, why don't we think about it in terms of a spectrum, right? When someone says, you're a cool cat, why does anyone go, oh, why do you have to bring another term into this conversation? Why can't you just say I'm nice? We agreed that nice people exist. Why can't I just be nice? So for me, it feels very much like personality, right?
Yeah, but we don't label personalities, and when we do, I get very uppity about it. I mean, you've heard me go off about how Enneagrams are made up bullshit. Sorry to all of the therapists listening that think pseudoscience is valid. But whether we're talking about Enneagrams or Big Five or these things, like, they can be helpful in creating like a broad category, but as we get more and more and more and more specific and granular, I just don't know how much they further the dialogue and the discourse. None of that, though, should be taken away, Scott, from what I hear as a successful journey and a really profitable challenge to the ideas that you were brought up with. And so for that reason alone, I can say that this word, if we're going to put it on trial, has some value and some benefit in the world. And I'm just excited to hear that you are beginning to understand yourself better by having more tools to look at the world through.
Yeah, Scott, if I could say something, I'm very encouraged to hear that you're on this journey of investigating and trying to figure out, where do you belong in this, rather than maybe looking at it as a spectrum, but in this cloud of potential categories that you belong to. How does it serve you? I think Christy said that. What is the purpose to it? How do these identities and you thinking about these categories serve you on your journey through life, right? And I think you're doing that. I think you started from a very binary position, where you said from a very conservative binary position. And as you're researching and learning more about different options, you're starting to realize that maybe it's not all of this or all of the other. But what if it's like a smorgasbord of different categories that you can create to create your own identity based upon different categories and different tendencies within yourself? Right? Maybe the word doesn't exist that fits who you are exactly. And you know what? Well, we're all so much the same, but we're also very different as well. So keep going. And if there isn't a word that quite fits what resonates with you, maybe be open to the fact that that word doesn't exist yet. And that's okay.
Yeah, or that word is just a shade of who you are. There are lots of people known as Scott, And yet, I'm sure the people who know and love you can take that word and form something of a definition of it that applies to you. And even if demi-gender is not 100% an accurate descriptor of who you are, if it gets in the ballpark, if it furthers the discourse, if it allows you to communicate or express yourself to other people, then so much the better.
Okay, thank you.
Go get
Yeah,
it.
I hope you will forgive us a little bit of debate back and forth, and that walks away with a little bit of insight and just support. We definitely appreciate you giving us a call either way.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the advice and talking about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Absolutely. We have a great night.
Thank you. You too.
So we've got a stacked queue full of calls, but I definitely didn't want to walk away today from this discussion about a landmark Supreme Court decision without remarking on the recent extension of the Title VII definitions of gender. Getting into all of that here in just a moment, I would like to go ahead and take this call from Charlie and see what we may be able to clear up and jump off from. Charlie, what can we do for you tonight?
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
I was really concerned actually about this ruling. I know that my privacy, because I've already started transition, so I know my privacy is just well kaput. Well, I'm concerned about, could this be used to invade my husband's privacy too? And since you have somebody that it deals with legality and stuff, I wanted to call and see if we could talk about this because this concerns me.
Yeah, Charlie and Johnny, can y'all catch us up a little bit on how privacy considerations may be taken into effect? I'm not really familiar with that aspect of the ruling.
Charlie, I'd love to hear what.
I'll let him do it.
Well, Charlie, I'd love to hear what your privacy concerns are with this particular one. Like, tell me
Well,
express your concerns.
I'm concerned that from what I have understood about this ruling, and I did do a little bit of checking into it, the president has proposed, and if I remember correctly, it's going through the House right now, and it has been ratified, and that it's supposed to take effect in August, but a doctor can make a decision that they can look into my background, see that I am transgender, and because they can see that I'm transgender, they can make decisions based on that, whether they want to be able to treat me or not, that they should not be forced to work on a patient if they are transgender and they don't agree with that. Also, that they can make choices not to give me transgender care. And, well, that's upsetting, of course, but then at the same time, it's like, that's done. What I'm worried about is, could somebody be able to look into my husband's history or into my history and make a choice not to be able to actually treat my husband as well, because we're both, because I'm transgender and he's my husband. So I'm wondering how far could this type of legislation be taken? And so that's why I'm coming at this point, especially knowing that you are a legal representative and you probably know more than I do about this.
So at first I thought you were talking about the recent opinion, the Supreme Court opinion expanding Title VII protections under the 1964 Civil Rights Act to transgender individuals. But I don't think you're talking about that, are you? You're talking about some proposed legislation by the Trump administration I'm thinking, and I'm not familiar with this. Is it to grant certain rights to hospitals? Is it having to do with the military?
Doctors, and it has gone through. First of all, I will say that much. It has gone through, and it's to take effect in August. The Trump administration was the one who had proposed it. And it literally states in the writing that they can take a look in your medical history and be able to make a decision about whether they treat you either for transgender medical care or for any reason. They can choose not to to treat you because it goes against the doctor's principles to treat somebody who is a transgender person.
Okay, I had heard a little bit about this earlier, and I had not researched this in prep for the show, and I hadn't gotten around to reading it. But yeah, I'm seeing that the Trump administration Friday, and this was as of June 12th, finalized a reg that overturns Obama-era protections for transgender people against sex discrimination in healthcare. And this is a Time magazine article that I just pulled up really briefly. The ACLU said it's going to sue the Trump administration. Not a surprise, and for another reason why you want to support your advocacy groups. So the administration has also moved to restrict military service by transgender people. We know that. I don't know enough about this to speak as to how it's going to affect you and your family. However, there's definitely going to be a lawsuit on this. There is a right to privacy. However, there's countervailing rights, and I want to see how it shakes out. I'm not familiar enough with the exact wording of the legislation or any of the how it's going to be employed to be able to speak one way or the other. But yeah, that's definitely something to keep our eyes on, and it's a bit of a shadow in the background that's going to affect millions of people. We're happy and we're tooting our horn over this victory. I guess it goes back to what we said before. We get this victory in this recent Supreme Court opinion, but then right while that's happening, we get these other regressions. So I'm sorry I don't know enough about it to be able to give you any additional enlightenment about it, but I'm going to look into it and I'll report back.
One thing to keep in mind though, is that this bill, this HHS bill, was passed, I believe, the week before the Supreme Court decision came down. And I know that Nick Fish of American Atheists and Andrew Seidel, who are two of the two people who are concerned about the legal aspects of separation of church and state, are saying that it's very possible that this new opinion on Title VII and what sex encompasses in terms of discrimination based on sex is going to make this HHS bill easy to beat, or easier to beat, when the lawsuit actually comes to court. So if the ACLU is bringing a lawsuit against this bill for being discriminatory, they now get to point to Title VII and say, the Supreme Court just ruled that you cannot discriminate based on sex, and sex includes transgender and non-binary and all of these other things. So it might actually help us out in the long run. It's not a sure deal at all, but there's some hope there.
So I hope that we're trending in the right direction. I'm sorry that we don't have more sophisticated legal advice at this stage, but it is good to know that these things are working themselves through the courts, but seem to be getting to where they need to go. The Supreme Court seems to have sort of ruled on this decision already. We'll see if it holds up.
Just as first blush, I don't want to contradict you, Christy, but just on first blush, if this is that previous decision that we were talking about today deals with employment discrimination, this might be something entirely different. I'd need to look at it, and I would not. I don't want to take away hope, but I wouldn't hope that any justices that voted in the majority in this one are going to vote in the majority on one that preserves transgender rights. This is why it's important to stay up on your advocacy. Find out what GLAAD is saying about this. What is the ACLU? How are they weighing in on this? and I'm gonna look into it. I need to know the ins and outs of it. There's always these clever little legal arguments based upon these principles that you would never think apply, but they're there. I'm gonna go back and I'll report back to the show, and hopefully we'll have some better news later.
Yeah, things are just very up in the air right now.
Yeah.
But thank you for calling, Charlie. I'm happy to talk to you. And I hope you get some answers either from the show next time we have Johnny on, or if you do more research and find out something new, feel free to call back or email us at sex@atheist-community.org, and we will happily talk more about this with you.
Oh, Charlie, did we lose you? All right. Well, thank you for calling. We appreciate you.
Thanks for calling, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie. Right,
yeah, so just again,
calls.
kind of a mixed bag. Yeah, y'all want to stick with the phones for just a moment?
Yeah, let's bump through these last two, and then make use of our lawyer friend as much as we can.
Great.
We're
going to speak with
point out that
Sean in Oklahoma. Yeah, go right ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, Christy. Can I point out that when I called the show a couple of weeks ago, you had never had more callers. And then I'm on the show, and have you ever had more callers than today?
Yeah, but I mean, if it makes you feel better, no.
It would make me feel so much better.
Then no.
Which is why I'm not giving it to you.
This is great.
Yeah, sorry.
Fair enough. We do appreciate you.
Boring.
Yeah, it's a pretty mediocre episode so far, right? Is that just me? Somewhere in the middle?
No?
Yeah, we're never going to get any more legal advice. Stop offending our guest, V. Sean, I have got you on the air. What can we do for you tonight?
How's it going, y'all?
Right, not too bad. What's on your mind?
This is primarily for Vi and Christy. I'm just curious, did y'all ever experience in your life, like in a position, like, I don't know what y'all's affiliation with religion, but y'all have like a homophobic or transphobic view?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was very much part and parcel of who I was coming up. And if I'm being frank, it's part of who I am now. You know, the type of homophobia, transphobia is still deep inside of my DNA. And frankly, it turns into a lot of uncomfortable feelings towards the world outside, and frankly, a lot of uncomfortable feelings towards myself. And that's something I'm continuing to process and work at, but it's a struggle that I myself and many, many, many people continue to deal with for much of their life. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Mine is more of a rejection, like lifelong rejection, straight people, normal people, gay people, anything like that. So I think it stems from more of a hatred because I got rejected than the like Christian type view. So I guess I was just curious, and you kind of answered that about it. It doesn't go away. You kind of, I guess it's a fight against yourself and your upbringing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll let you jump in, V, but I guess I'll just clarify that it is something that I still at this stage of life deal with and cope with. And I certainly, as a therapist, work with folks who have struggled with it in various ways at various stages to various degrees. But that isn't to suggest that it need to be a lifelong ailment. I know that my internalized homophobia has definitely changed dramatically over the past 10 years. But in particular, sort of the self-loathing or the things that come with it is something that I've really tackled and really processed and moved on from. And I do think that there's plenty of opportunity for healing. I see it, frankly, every day when I go to work. But V, you jump in with your story if you would.
I would say that it's very much like breaking any habit, right? So there's always going to be a part of the time where it is going to be really hard, and you're going to have to think very hard about it in order to stop yourself from thinking of a thing or feeling a certain way. You're going to have to interrupt that thought pattern because it's been kind of imprinted into your brain. And so it's going to take a lot of work to start that process of wait, why am I thinking about this? I don't believe that anymore. This isn't who I am. I'm going to do something. I'm going to think something else. I'm going to do research. I'm going to forgive whoever, or feel good about myself. It's going to take a lot of time at first, but it is going to get easier. And there's always going to be that moment where you're like, oh, that's weird. Why did I think that? That seems really strange that just showed up out of the blue all of a sudden. And there are still people from my past who, if I met now, I would have no problem with, but I still have this kind of icky feeling when I think about them, because I met them as a Christian who was full of judgment, who was full of fear. And so I still carry negative feelings about certain people with no logical reason at all, knowing full well that if I met them today, we'd probably be really good friends. But there is this switch that happens. So you can look for that. That is something that you should feel hopeful about. It is going to be hard at first, but it's not going to be this way forever.
All right. Wow. Yeah, y'all answered that pretty well. I really appreciate y'all.
Appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just encourage you to continue on that journey. And if you are able to, look for the support of being in community, of being around other queer folks, of talking to a therapist. There are a number of great books. I mean, there's so much out there. I don't want to just overload you with resources, but I would say that internalized hatred is something that you can work on and work with, and there's a lot of opportunity for healing. So even if it's a struggle, don't give up. There's a lot there to be had.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the therapist often, so I appreciate that. And if anybody else is listening, if you do have a therapist, I do have a therapist, so I appreciate that. But if you do have a therapist and you don't like them, find a new one. There's better ones always out there. So I appreciate y'all.
I love it.
Thank you so much for calling.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, doing my job for me. If nothing else, like normalizing the idea of healthy, happy people can incredibly benefit from therapy. And if you're not benefiting from your therapy, take a good, hard, long look in the mirror. Check your intentions. Make sure you're, working the program, that you're doing what you need to do to make it work. And then take a long look at your therapist and try to think about whether or not they're an asshole or just an asshole to you. If it's not the right fit, what we know from therapy research, I know I'm on my platform, but let me just say that what we know from all the research around therapy is that more important than your therapist's education, their specific orientation, all of these different pieces, the important aspect is that relationship. If you don't like your therapist, that's okay, but you should be asking yourself why and really examining whether or not this is somebody that you feel like you can have a meaningful relationship with, somebody you can share your secrets with, because that can go an incredible way towards healing some of this pain. So I really appreciate the caller just bringing all that up and giving me a chance to give my little speech. So I apologize. We can jump right back into the episode.
Christy, do you find that the stigma against going to a counselor or a therapist is diminishing over time? Do you think that it's staying the same? Do you think it's increasing?
I would say in a lot of ways it seems to be decreasing, but it's almost like the conversation we had earlier about sort of middling or mediocre representation. You now every time you turn on Netflix, you see somebody going to see a therapist, and I think that that's new. However, when you turn on Netflix, 9 times out of 10, that therapist is gonna fuck the main character. I don't know why. I don't know who decided that was a trend or a trope that we needed to put in all of our media. Netflix in particular, I'm going to call out as being like very responsible for this. I mean, they made an entire show about the idea, and I don't know what any of that's about. But without any specific numbers, without like a lifelong career in the field, I would say that stigma seems to be decreasing, but it's still super prevalent. I mean, I know other therapists that are embarrassed to go to see a therapist, which makes me wonder how they see their clients, just since we're here, I'll just unpack it super quickly. I want to remind the audience that seeing a therapist is not necessarily a sign that your life is a mess, that things have gone wrong. I like to encourage people to think about it as the same way you would with a physical therapist. If you just got out of a car accident, you'd probably be working with a physical therapist to perhaps learn how to walk again. If you just turned 60 and are looking to maintain your overall health, you may be working with some kind of trainer or physical therapist. If you are getting ready to run a marathon for the first time, you might be working with some kind of trainer or physical therapist. If you're about to perform at the Olympics or in the Super Bowl, you better believe those people have somebody in their lives that's helping support them to achieve at that super high level. So going to therapy doesn't mean anything about being broken or busted or unable to survive regular life. It just means you're at a point where you think you could benefit from some extra support.
Yeah. My favorite dichotomy with that is there's a tweet that I absolutely love. And it says, when boomers talk about getting therapy, I went and I got therapy the other day. When millennials talk about therapy, in all caps, oh my God, my therapist is amazing and I love them. And there's so there is a trend towards accepting it, at least that I've seen online.
It's a growth market, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Good field to be in. But thank you all for lending me my soapbox for my pet project for just a moment. I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a lawyer here and find out a little bit more, right? Yeah, thanks, Johnny. Find out a little bit more about this recent Supreme Court case that seems to be expanding the Civil Rights Act and kind of go back to that question of, does it matter? What can you tell us about this recent Supreme Court ruling, just in brief, if you would?
Does it matter? Yes, it matters quite a bit because it affects the lives of every transgender person who has a job, and the vulnerability that they potentially face if they have a shit boss and work for a shit company, or even if they have a not shit boss and not shit company, but that company gets into maybe some bad economics. So I had done some research about this some weeks ago, and I was actually quite surprised that actually, I think the first time I paid attention to it was in preparation for Godless Bitches months ago. And the decision had been argued, but it hadn't been decided. And my understanding of it was that there had been some legal challenges to the application of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, which governs and prohibits discrimination based on several factors, including sex. And the plaintiffs in the two cases that I had followed, and let me just get the name up in front of me because I just had it, but names always pop out of my head. Bostock is the one that pops into my mind. The Bostock opinion, the Bostock case involved a transgender person who was fired based upon being transgender. Of course, there may have been some pretextual firing initially. I don't know, but basically, what the company had argued was that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not protect people based on sexual orientation or gender. It applies specifically to sex. And that would typically mean you can't be fired for being a man or for being a woman or face any kind of employment discrimination. And that can take a lot of different forms. It can be a demotion. It could be a change in job. It could be a change in responsibility, pay changes, things like that. And the argument on the part of of Bostock was that this was because the person was transgender, they're essentially committing discrimination against them because they don't conform to certain understandings of what a man or a woman should be, right? They're taking the opposite to, in that way of thinking, the opposite role. And I was actually thinking that this wasn't going to fly when I read about the case at first. I figured that under the wording of Title VII, as it was written in 1964, and whatever amendments may have come afterwards, that there wasn't enough in the actual text of the statute for the petitioner to prevail on this one, and for Bostock to prevail. And it turns out that I was wrong, and that Gorsuch wrote an opinion looking at that same kind of language, that textual analysis of the Civil Rights Act. In preparing for today, I did a little bit of research, and I'd like to say, in preparing for today, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for today because I'm a surprise guest on the show. I hope everyone knows that. But the first thing I do, and perhaps some viewers on the different shows who have seen me on different shows might recognize this trend, where when I get a piece of news, I go straight to the opposite side first. And the first place I went was the National Review. And I say the opposite side because I don't consider myself in line with the typical views of the conservative people who read and who write for the National Review. And what I saw here was an analysis of the opinion in this case. I'm trying to pull it up here so I can quote the language that I thought was so compelling. Let me get there. 1 second. And I apologize for this delay. I think the argument is that Gorsuch took a textual approach looking at the language of the Civil Rights Act. And of course, the dissent said he did it as a kind of, was it as a straw man, or he did it as a sort of a backdoor way of looking at the text of it? The opposition to this decision doesn't believe that this is a textual analysis. And I think that's really interesting because the two opposites of this argument are coming from Kavanaugh and from Gorsuch, both of whom are Trump appointees who looked at this from very different perspectives. So before I completely lose my thread, did you have any additional questions about it, Christy? Because I sort of went off.
No, I appreciate just getting a little bit of an overview. I think that we had kind of maybe misspoke and misunderstood Charlie, the caller, just a little bit earlier. So I want to make sure to get kind of the facts of the case out on the table. Yeah. And then to kind of contextualize it in the larger question of, is it going to change public opinion? You know, I certainly appreciate that the protections matter. And that there is value in that, just as there is absolutely value, of course, in extending the right to marry to gay folks. My other question, though, here is this going to have meaningful impact on not just protecting trans people from losing their employment? Although, yeah, that is a very real question that I have, is whether or not this is going to have a meaningful impact there. But then also, is it going to affect just being a trans person in the workplace? Is this going to change the way your boss treats you, or at least protect you from certain types of treatment? Is it going to change your relationship with Carol in accounting? Is it going to change the way that people relate to trans folks on a national level? You know, obviously that's not a super answerable question, but in the context of this larger discussion, how is this going to change the world, or will it?
I don't know yet, but I can tell you that nothing's going to stop employers from coming up with fully cooked pretexts to fire someone based
Sure.
upon their race or sex or sexual orientation. Just like whenever we try to close loopholes for companies so that they pay their fair share of taxes, they hire attorneys to find new ways of exploiting the language in the new tax laws. I think we'll see that. Is this cause to celebrate on the same level as Obergefell versus Hodges? I don't know. I want to hear what, strictly speaking, experts in this area of civil rights law have to say. I'm a litigating attorney. I deal mostly with I have done some civil rights law in the past, but my expertise is not in appellate law, although I've drafted tons of appellate briefs, nor is it in LGBTQIA plus issues before state Supreme Courts or the federal Supreme Court. So when I read it in to some degree, I don't want to say this, but I guess I'm a little bit above an average citizen as far as understanding maybe some of the consequences of it. But there's depth in these decisions. There are strategic moves being made by the justices when they choose who writes the opinion, when they pick the language that they do, when they rely upon a particular tack for that argument. And I'm not as well versed in this as I would want to be. I don't think this is necessarily. I think the experts at GLAAD and the ACLU would be the ones that could give you a better estimate of how this is going to affect the future. I'm hopeful, but I think Vi and we talked a little bit about. I'm suspicious that Gorsuch wrote it. It's not surprising. I would be especially surprised if Alito were in the majority. But is this a setup for something else? I believe we were talking about, does this opinion equate sex and gender in some way and tie it together legally so that we can later attack this notion? I don't know.
Yeah, that was my concern after reading it initially. I was like, I haven't tracked it far too many turfs to trust the equation of sex and gender. And some people have made really good points that, gender expression and discrimination based on gender expression is still rooted for the majority of people in, the sex that you were assigned at birth and whether or not you're conforming to that. So in a way, I get that this is, as broad an interpretation as possible and is going to help. But I'm also waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's 2020. You don't know anymore.
Trust nothing in 2020. Maybe it's the wine I've been sipping secretly through most of the show, but I'd like to kind of jump in here on behalf of the audience, but mostly myself, to I guess just ask for a little bit of clarification. What is this this sort of like secret underhanded fear that you have in Gorsuch's opinion?
Vi, I think you articulated it far better to me than I shared in that conversation. Do you want to weigh in a little bit?
Sure. The way that I understand it is they knew that this opinion was going to get passed, that this was going to be the majority because it was a 5-2 at this point, or 6-2. And so they knew that it was going to pass. So they had somebody who was on the other side write the opinion in a way that watered it down and made exceptions in order to make it more easily dismissible or malleable later. So Gorsuch did put together a clause in his opinion that said, well, we can legislate it up to a point, but if it's sincere religious belief that's making you do this, then it would become an infringement on religion, and then, we would have to have that conversation. So he hedged a lot, and what could have been a very strong and kind of forthright piece about this is where we stand did become a lot more wishy-washy and leave loopholes explicitly open, especially in regard to religious freedoms. So my suspicion, and Johnny's as well, I believe, is that the tactic was to get somebody to write the piece that would water it down to the point of being able to be contested later on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, when the Supreme Court takes a case, they will, although we have these amazing cases that have widespread society-changing effects, I don't think that's what the Supreme Court is. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to decide whether or not a particular law is constitutional or not, and they try to narrowly tailor it as much as possible, because, generally speaking, the job of the legislature is to, through the democratic process or the Republican process, however you like it, to pass laws based upon what the people have said. And the Supreme Court is a little tiny aristocracy of 9 who may or may not be in touch with the needs of society. That's not their job. Their job is to decide what the Constitution requires or what statutes say to interpret constitutional provisions and statutory provisions and determine whether or not a particular decision is valid, you might say, or legitimate. I'll say that. And so I'm trying to find this one provision. It was really good. It was in the National Review article, and I have very mixed feelings about doing this, by the way. But I'd encourage the listeners of this show, the viewers of the show, to really look to the National Review and other conservative media outlets. You might want to skip Fox News when they're looking at an analysis of things that they're excited about. Because the National Review does have some people of good conscience and good brain power writing on this. And I'm trying to find the part I had it, and then I lost it. Well, you know what? I do apologize. I'm not going to find it, and I'm not going to waste the viewers' time trying to find it. But the name of the article is "After Bostock, We're All Textualists Now," and you can find that at thenationalreview.com. And it talks about that textualism and what was it? I think it's called pirate ship type of textualism, which is what Kavanaugh accused Gorsuch of. Flying a flag of textualism and actually being a backdoor way of reading it in some other fashion. But I
feel like I want to watch a fight between Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, just because it would be like a food fight consisting entirely of mayo, just throwing mayo at each other.
Well, was Roberts in the majority in this opinion?
Yes, he was in both. He was in the majority of this one, and then the one about saving DACA. So I have no idea what he's doing.
So right, and he was appointed by Bush, correct?
No, he's been pretty staunchly conservative this whole time. So, and
yet, when it comes to a lot of different opinions, he's much more nuanced. He's not flatly in one side. Right. And if Gorsuch is I think if they're doing their jobs, right, and they're not political hacks, then they're going to be looking at this and looking at maybe the text of the Civil Rights Act. What does it include? Should it include sexual orientation under sex? That's reasonable. People can disagree, but why did Gorsuch decide to write this opinion? Is it solely because he's trying to lay a trap in the future, or does he really mean that? The argument makes sense, right? And so that's why I was saying earlier in the show how these Supreme Court opinions are fine and dandy. It's better than the opposite opinion, right? But there's
Sure.
nothing stopping the legislature, and that's something that Kavanaugh, I think, weighed in on this. And I know that the author of this article said, we're going to be hearing from the legislature. Trump's administration is going to propose something, and the Senate's going to pass something, maybe in the future, unless we can get Trump to just go away and do whatever he likes to do besides presidenting. But
He doesn't
until
like presidenting. What are you?
yeah,
Turns
exactly.
out it's hard. Healthcare. Who knew?
Right. Who knew? No one knew.
Well,
right.
then ultimately, I guess just in 30 seconds or less, my question becomes: are we going to see like meaningful shifts in the culture war as it relates to the employability, the validity of trans identities? Do you think that, 5 years from now, we may not be having a like celebratory anniversary episode as we discuss this particular decision, but do we feel like the hearts and minds are trending in the right direction overall? Let me, as we're getting on 8:30, let me give y'all just a few seconds to kind of respond to that, if I could.
We're
Hearts
in a
and
bubble.
minds, yes.
Sorry, please, V.
Hearts and minds, yes. I would say the trend is positive. In terms of politics, I'm not as hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go a little bit further in the pessimistic category. And I think that we're in a nice little bubble of folks who are compassionate and understanding about lots of different kinds of people. I want to know what Topeka has to say. No offense to Topeka, but I want to know what does my mother have to say about this? What does my father say? I'm sure he doesn't give a hoot. But if he were to have to commit to a decision, he would think it's bullshit. That's my guess.
Yeah, no, that's fair to say. And I mean, I can point out that I don't know that my mother's opinion has changed in any meaningful way in terms of gay rights since the Obergefell decision. But I'll tell you what, my younger siblings have definitely changed their opinion in the last 5 years, and the tone around the Thanksgiving dinner table has changed to reflect that, to reflect those, aging, growing, developing voices. So, I don't know that we've done anything to solve the mysteries today of the universe and the direction that it's headed. But I have to feel on this 5th anniversary of the Obergefell decision that even if we are not where we maybe hoped we would be 5 years on, and even if things are not where they need to be in order to protect people who, specifically trans folks, are still being attacked, are still being literally and physically murdered in many, many, many dramatic cases across this country. In the light of that, I still want to hold on to a sense of hopefulness. And maybe that's naive, maybe that's ridiculous, but I think that there is enough to go on to have some sense of idealism in this world. I don't know. Is there any room for that for y'all?
I think it's how we survive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been watching a bit of Street Fighter 2 Turbo tournaments on YouTube in my off time, and
Sure. Yeah. Let's just go ahead and act like that's totally normal. Keep going.
I'm going to go in this direction.
No kink shame.
When a fighter starts winning, that fighter can start enjoying the psychological benefit of a rally, right? And it can gain momentum, this particular player, and can win. But there are combo breakers, and that can stop a trend in its footsteps, right? And I think, that old yarn, that old tired phrase, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We may have gotten a good decision recently, a couple of them in a row. There's no guarantee there's not going to be a combo breaker coming a couple months from now. So let's keep on working toward advancing the cause. Donate if you have money and time and resources to the ACLU, to GLAAD, to other organizations that are putting up this fight, not just in atheism or in human rights issues, but if you care at all about the environment, there are fights being fought every day by the Natural Resources Defense Council, by the Sierra Club. A lot of groups are doing this kind of work, and they're fighting it not only in the communities, but they're also fighting it in the courts, and they need your money. So if you've got any extra of it, please help. I'm not a lot of it going around right now, but maybe, 6 months from now, you might have some extra cash. I don't know.
No, well, I really appreciate that call to action. And on that note, I want to take a moment and just thank you for being here, especially kind of jumping in at the last minute, as you said, and being available to help us understand these terribly complex and confusing and frankly frustrating stories and times that we find ourselves in. On that same token, I want to make sure to take a moment to thank our incredible crew that has put in an enormous amount of work to get all of this going, all social distancing and respectfully staying out of our studio while we all work from home. Thank you all so much for all of the efforts and for helping to just keep the library safe as we all work together to try and beat this thing. I know that I maybe bring this up almost every week, but I'll say it again. This is not normal times. And so if you are hearing the sound of my voice, you are living through a global fucking pandemic, and that's going to weigh on you. So be in community, be working with your therapist, be talking to your friends, be calling your family, be petting your pet, whatever it is that you need in order to feel like a person during these like really abnormal, really difficult times. So Vi, of course, I want to thank you for being here and doing this with me every week. I want to be incredibly grateful to the audience and all of the remarkable callers that we had. If you are watching this live, we are going to jump briefly into the Discord server as soon as this episode is over. So please feel free to join us. Everyone else, and in the meantime, this feels like a very good moment to take a much needed and much deserved opportunity to give yourself a big old orgasm. Or better yet, give somebody else one.
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?